There is a family that ruled over everything, not a country. Everything, every ocean, every thunderstorm, every war, every harvest, every human life on Earth. And for 3,000 years, we have celebrated this family, built temples to honor them, carved their faces into marble, written their names in gold. But here's what nobody says out loud. This family was a complete disaster. Infidelity on an industrial scale. Children thrown off cliffs, brothers locked in cages for centuries. A father who ate his own kids. Not as a metaphor, literally. And the wild part? We don't call this a scandal, we call it mythology. Today, we're taking a different look at the gods, not the version you read in school, the version where you look at the actual record, the decisions they made, the people they hurt, the power they protected. And you ask, would we accept this from anyone else? Because if you stripped away the divine status, if you removed the lightning bolts and the immortality, what you're left with is one of the most dysfunctional ruling families in history, and their story has a lot more in common with the Windsors, the Romanovs, and the Medici than anybody wants to admit. So buckle up, because the real story of Olympus is a lot darker than you think. Every great dynasty in history starts the same way. Someone seizes power by force, then rewrites the story to make it look inevitable. The Olympians were no different. But their origin story is so dark, so brutal, that it makes most real-world coups look polite. Let's go back to the very beginning. Before the gods, there were the Titans. 12 of them, ancient, enormous, powerful, and led by one figure called Cronos, the king of all creation. Now, Cronos had everything. He ruled over a golden age of peace and prosperity, but Cronos had a problem. Actually, let's call it what it is, and Cronos had a prophecy problem. It had been foretold that one of his own children would overthrow him. So Cronos did what every paranoid ruler in history has done when they feel their power being threatened. He removed the threat. Except, in this case, removing the threat meant eating his own children alive, one by one. As each child was born to his wife Rhea, Cronos swallowed them whole. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. Gone. Not dead, just trapped, living inside their father's stomach. Now, here's the thing that never gets enough attention. This was the king of the Golden Age, the ruler of paradise on earth, and he was eating his children out of pure political self-preservation. This is your founding dynasty. This is where Olympus comes from. Eventually, his wife Rhea had enough. When Zeus was born, she wrapped a rock in cloth and handed it to Cronos, who swallowed it without question, the king of creation, fooled by a rock. Meanwhile, the real baby Zeus was smuggled to Crete, raised in secret, fed honey by nymphs hidden from his own father. That's not a divine origin story. That's a royal family hiding a child from an abusive patriarch, and that detail matters. Because Zeus grew up knowing exactly what his father was. He knew the playbook, and we'll see soon enough, he used it himself. When Zeus was old enough, he went back. He disguised himself as a servant, poisoned his father's drink, and Cronos vomited up every child he'd swallowed. His siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, emerged fully grown, furious, and ready for war. What followed was called the Titanomachy. A 10-year war between the Titans and the Olympians. 10 years. To put that in human terms, the entire First and Second World Wars combined lasted less than 9 years. This was a conflict that shook the foundations of existence itself, and it ended only because Zeus freed the Cyclops and the 100-handed giants from their underground prisons, beings who had been locked away by the Titans for generations, and armed them as allies. The Titans lost. Zeus cast Cronos and his brothers into Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld. And on that day, the three brothers divided the world between them. Zeus got the sky and the earth. Poseidon got the sea. Hades got the underworld. Democracy? No, three brothers with absolute power and a quick conversation to decide who gets what. This is the foundation of Olympus. Not a system, not laws, not merit, a coup, a family carve-up, and the permanent suppression of anyone who questioned it. Sound familiar? Every ruling dynasty in history has this same blueprint. Seize power by force, legitimize it through narrative, crush the opposition, call it divine right. The Olympians just wrote it down first. Now, we need to talk about Zeus, because you cannot understand the dysfunction of Olympus without understanding the man at the top. In most mythology courses, Zeus is presented as the father figure, the wise king, the cosmic judge, the guy who keeps order. And technically, that's true, he made the rules. He just didn't follow them. Micro hook. Let's look at the actual record. Zeus had a wife, Hera, queen of the gods, and Zeus was also, depending on which ancient sources you read, involved with somewhere between 57 and over 100 different women and goddesses. Not rumors. These are documented, named encounters in the original Greek and Roman texts. 57 at the absolute minimum. For comparison, Henry VIII, who has gone down in history as one of the most notoriously unfaithful monarchs of all time, had 6 wives. Zeus makes Henry VIII look modest, but here's where it gets darker, because many of these weren't choices. The myths consistently describe Zeus approaching women who were uninterested, who ran, who said no, and Zeus pursued them anyway. He transformed himself into a swan, a bull, a shower of gold, a cloud, an eagle, specifically to get closer to women who were trying to escape him. Europa was abducted from the beach by a bull. She thought she was feeding a gentle animal. That was Zeus. Io was literally transformed into a cow by Zeus to hide what he'd done to her from Hera. Then Hera sent a gadfly to torment her for years. The woman who was the victim ended up being punished, and that happens over and over in these myths. Zeus does something. The woman pays the price. Callisto was a huntress in Artemis's sacred group, sworn to celibacy, living in the woods. Zeus disguised himself as Artemis herself to get close to her. When Callisto became pregnant, Hera turned her into a bear. Artemis, believing she was hunting an enemy, nearly killed her. The victim ends up fleeing for her life. Zeus doesn't face a single consequence. Now at this point you might be wondering, why wasn't Zeus held accountable? And that's exactly the right question. Because the answer tells you everything about how Olympus actually operated. The short answer, nobody could stop him. Not Hera. She was his wife and his sister, a marriage that was itself not a choice on her part, according to several ancient traditions. And even she, the queen of the gods, could only react, never prevent, never punish. Not the other gods, they were afraid, not humans, they were completely powerless. The long answer is more interesting. Zeus had already survived one overthrow attempt. And it failed spectacularly. Hera, Poseidon, and Athena, 3 of the most powerful Olympians, once conspired together and literally chained Zeus to his bed while he slept. Think about that. 3 gods, the queen, the sea king, and the goddess of wisdom, working together against one man. And even then, it required a 100-handed giant named Briareos to free Zeus and restore order. The one time the system was challenged from within, it collapsed almost immediately, because the system was designed to make Zeus impossible to remove. This is the thing about Olympian power. It wasn't just physical strength, though Zeus had plenty of that. It was structural. Zeus controlled the weather, which meant he controlled agriculture. He controlled the thunderbolt, which was the ultimate weapon. He controlled the divine hierarchy that determined every other god's power. And crucially, he controlled the narrative. When Zeus turned Io into a cow, the official story was that Hera was jealous and vindictive. When Zeus pursued Europa, it became a love story. When Zeus fathered Heracles through Alcmene, the result was celebrated as the birth of the greatest hero in human history. Every scandal got reframed as mythology. Every victim got turned into a cautionary tale. Every consequence landed on someone other than Zeus. Sound familiar? This is the oldest PR playbook in the world. When you're powerful enough, you don't suppress the scandal. You reframe it until the scandal becomes the story, and you disappear from the frame entirely. Now, let's talk about Hera. Because Hera's story is probably the most misunderstood in all of mythology. For thousands of years, she's been portrayed as the villain, the jealous wife, the bitter queen, the one who persecutes innocent women, and yes, some of those things happened. But when you look at the full picture, Hera's story isn't a story about jealousy. It's a story about what happens to the most powerful woman in existence when the system she operates in is fundamentally designed against her. Let's start with how Hera became queen. In the most common version of the myth, Zeus pursued Hera for years. She refused him. So Zeus transformed himself into an injured, shivering cuckoo bird, and Hera, compassionate, nurturing, took the helpless little bird and held it close to warm it. At which point, Zeus revealed himself and used her vulnerability against her. Hera, to preserve her honor, agreed to marry him. That's the myth, that's the official account. That is how the queen of the gods became queen. Not by choice, by manipulation. And from that point on, every single day of her marriage was a front row seat to her husband's absolute indifference to her. Visual side by side, Hera isolated on her throne/Zeus, surrounded by a court of admirers. Here's what gets lost in every retelling of these myths. Every time Hera is described as jealous, she is reacting to a real thing, a documented, named, specific thing. Zeus isn't rumored to be unfaithful. It's happening in public, in plain sight, repeatedly, with zero attempt to hide it. And Hera, as queen, has no legal recourse, no divine court to appeal to, no institution that will hear her case. She has exactly as much power as Zeus allows her to have, and not one drop more. So what does Hera do? She does the only thing she can do. She punishes the women. She persecutes the children. She directs her rage at everyone except the person causing it. And this is absolutely worth examining. Because on the surface, yes, her treatment of Io is cruel. Her persecution of Heracles, who, let's remember, was an innocent child, is brutal. But pull back the frame. Hera is operating inside a closed system where the person responsible for her suffering is also the person with the power to stop her if she ever went after him directly. And she knows it. She tried. Remember, she was one of 3 gods who chained Zeus to his bed. She was punished for it. Zeus hung her from the sky by her wrists with golden chains, anvils attached to her ankles, and left her suspended there as a demonstration to anyone who might get similar ideas. The queen of the gods, hung from the sky as a public warning by her husband. And after that, she knew going after Zeus directly meant consequences she couldn't survive. So she went sideways, and history called her the villain. There is a psychological term for this. When someone is trapped in a system of abuse but cannot safely direct their response at the source of the abuse, they often redirect it. They find targets they can reach. That doesn't excuse the harm Hera caused, but it does explain why a story that starts with a man somehow ends with a woman being remembered as the monster. This is Olympus's most repeating pattern. The powerful person at the top engineers a situation where the costs fall on everyone else, and history does the rest. While we're on Hera, let's talk about something that mythology almost never addresses directly: the marriages of Olympus. Because when you actually map them out, or when you look at who married whom and why, you start to see a pattern that would be immediately recognizable to any historian of dynastic politics. Zeus's first wife, officially, was Metis, goddess of wisdom and counsel. He swallowed her whole, as we discussed. His second was Themis, goddess of divine law and order. Their union produced the fates and the seasons. Convenient. He literally married law and order, absorbed it, and could now claim to embody it. His third was Eurynome, then Demeter, his own sister, then Mnemosyne, goddess of memory, 9 nights, 9 children, the 9 muses. His sixth was Leto, who gave him Apollo and Artemis. His seventh was Hera, his permanent queen. Notice what he was collecting: wisdom, law, order, memory, the arts, prophecy. Every divine portfolio that mattered passed through Zeus at some point. He didn't just want power over the sky. He wanted authority over the entire conceptual universe. Wisdom swallowed, law married and absorbed, memory absorbed, harvest absorbed through Demeter, and then finally Hera. Hera represented marriage, family, and legitimate birth. By marrying the goddess of those things, Zeus claimed ownership over the institution of family itself. He didn't just lead the family, he was married to the concept. Any challenge to his family arrangements was therefore symbolically, cosmically, a challenge to the divine order of family as an institution. That's not coincidence. That's architecture. And what about the other Olympian marriages? Hephaestus was married to Aphrodite, the beautiful matched, with the forge scarred, a pairing that worked for nobody. Some traditions say Hera arranged this marriage as revenge against Aphrodite, who was too beautiful to be left unattached, and therefore politically dangerous. Others say Zeus arranged it, giving Hephaestus something for his years of suffering, and neutralizing Aphrodite's power by yoking her to someone controllable. Either way, Aphrodite had no say. The goddess of love did not choose her husband. Let that one sit. The divine personification of love and desire was arranged into a loveless marriage as a matter of political management. No wonder she spent eternity looking elsewhere. And then there's Persephone, Persephone's story. The girl taken from her mother Demeter, brought underground to be queen of the dead, is one of the most well-known myths in all of history. We know what it explains: the seasons. Demeter grieves, winter comes, Persephone returns, spring begins. Beautiful, cosmic, meaningful. But let's look at the actual mechanics of this marriage. Hades saw Persephone, wanted her, went to Zeus and asked for her. Zeus agreed, without consulting Demeter, without consulting Persephone. Zeus gave away his daughter, and we know she's his daughter because her mother is Demeter, one of his unions, to his brother, without a conversation, as a favor. Hades then opened the earth, grabbed Persephone from a field where she was picking flowers, and pulled her underground. The screams of Persephone were heard across the entire earth. Demeter heard them and began searching. For 9 days and 9 nights she searched, torch in hand, eating nothing, sleeping nowhere. No god came to help her. No one told her what had happened. Helios, the sun who saw everything, initially stayed silent. It took 9 days before Demeter learned the truth, that the king of the gods, her former partner, the father of her daughter, had given that daughter away without a word. Demeter's response? She refused to let anything grow. The entire earth went barren. Humans began to starve. The gods began to lose their worship. Only then, only when it was costing them, did the gods intervene. Zeus sent Hermes to bring Persephone back. But here's the last twist. Before Persephone left the underworld, she ate 6 pomegranate seeds. Some traditions say this was an accident. Others say Hades arranged it. A few ancient sources suggest, and this is the version that makes the most psychological sense, that Persephone chose to eat them. Because if she ate the seeds of the underworld, she had to return. 6 seeds meant 6 months underground every year, which meant she wasn't entirely under anyone's control. Not Hades, not Zeus, not even Demeter. She found the one mechanism in the entire divine system that gave her a kind of agency. Every year, half the world grows cold, not because a god is sad, maybe because a woman found the only door in a locked room and decided to use it. Every great dynasty eventually produces the same crisis. What do you do with the next generation? You raised them in the shadow of enormous power. You gave them abilities they didn't ask for. You put them in situations no one survives clean. And then you wonder why they're broken. The children of Olympus are a case study in this. Let's take Ares first. Ares is the god of war, which means the world has always treated him like the bad guy, the bloodthirsty one, the violent one. Even the other gods apparently hated him. Zeus himself in the Iliad tells Ares he's the most detestable god on Olympus. His own father said that to his face. But here's the question no one asks. What exactly was Ares supposed to become? His father was a narcissist who controlled everything through fear. His mother was in a loveless marriage she couldn't escape. He grew up in a household where power was the only currency that mattered, where violence was used as a political tool, where his own grandmother had been publicly humiliated and his aunts and uncles had been psychologically warped. And so Ares became the thing his environment shaped him to be, the embodiment of uncontrolled rage, the god who runs toward conflict because that's all he was ever taught. He wasn't born violent. He was raised in a world where violence was power. And then everyone pointed at him and called him the broken one. Then there's Hephaestus, and this one is genuinely hard to look at. Hephaestus was the god of the forge, the craftsman, the one who built the palaces, who made the weapons, who forged the armor, the most skilled maker in all of existence. And yet, Hephaestus walked with a limp, was described as ugly, as misshapen, the only Olympian who didn't quite fit the beautiful, powerful, ideal image of divinity. There are two versions of how that happened. In the first version, Hephaestus was born that way, and Hera, ashamed of his appearance, threw him from Mount Olympus, her own child, because he wasn't perfect enough. In the second version, Hephaestus saw Zeus hurting Hera, tried to intervene, and Zeus threw him off the mountain as punishment. He fell for an entire day. He survived, but he walked with a limp for eternity. Think about that for a moment. Either version of this story tells you something devastating about Olympus as a place to grow up. In one version, a mother discards her child because he doesn't meet the family standard of perfection. In the other version, a child tries to protect his mother from his father's abuse, and the child is the one who gets thrown off a cliff. Either way, the child falls. Either way, the child is permanently damaged, and nobody in the family is held responsible. What did Hephaestus do with that experience? He went underground, literally. He built his forge beneath a volcano, surrounded himself with his work, and became the most productive god on Olympus, while remaining the most isolated. He eventually married Aphrodite, goddess of love, the most beautiful goddess, given to him as a wife. And Aphrodite was publicly, notoriously, openly having an affair with Ares, the brother who got everything Hephaestus didn't. The physical strength, the battlefield glory, the easy charm. Hephaestus found out. He built a trap, a golden net, caught them together, and then called all the Olympians to witness his humiliation because he wanted justice. The other gods laughed. Hermes said he'd gladly take Ares' place if it meant sleeping with Aphrodite. That was the tribunal. That was the accountability Olympus offered. Laughter. This is what dynasties do to the people who don't fit the mold. They extract everything useful from them. They give them the minimum in return. And when it goes wrong, they laugh. Let's go back to that moment after the Titans fell. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. 3 brothers. One world. They drew lots. Random chance. Zeus got the sky. Poseidon got the sea. Hades got the underworld. Sounds fair, right? Think about what each of those actually means. Zeus gets everything bright, everything seen. The sky, Olympus, the living earth, the worship of humans, the glory, the power, the light. Poseidon gets the oceans, which cover most of the earth, but he also seethes constantly that Zeus lords over him. He's described as perpetually angry, shaking the earth when he doesn't get his way, causing earthquakes out of spite. And Hades. Hades gets the underworld, the place of death, the dark, the forgotten, the realm where nothing grows and no one chooses to go. Hades didn't ask for this. He drew the short lot. And then he spent eternity in isolation, ruling over the dead, visited only by souls who didn't want to be there. Here's what's interesting. Hades is portrayed throughout mythology as one of the most even-tempered, just, and impartial gods. He makes judgments on the dead without passion. He enforces his laws consistently. He doesn't participate in the chaos of Olympus, and he's the one associated with terror, with darkness, with evil, in the popular imagination. Why? Because he got the bad deal. And in Olympus, the person who loses the draw is also the person who gets blamed. Poseidon is a masterclass in what dysfunction looks like when it has enormous power and nowhere to put it. He wanted Athens. Athena got it. He wanted control of Corinth. Helios got it. He wanted Aegina. Zeus gave it to someone else. Every time Poseidon tried to claim something, he was overruled. And every time he was overruled, he responded by causing catastrophic natural disasters. He flooded the Argolid when he lost Athens. He kept the great hero Odysseus from reaching home for 10 years as revenge for one blinded Cyclops, who happened to be Poseidon's son. 10 years, an entire generation of a man's life. His wife nearly forced into remarriage, his son growing up without a father, his kingdom in chaos. Because Poseidon was angry. And nobody held Poseidon accountable. Nobody could. This is what you get when you build a system where power is absolute and accountability is optional. Everyone at the top has a grievance. Everyone at the top has a wound. And everyone at the top has the power to make that wound into someone else's catastrophe. The humans pay. They always pay. Every dynasty has insiders and outsiders. The insiders get the power, the palaces, the narrative. The outsiders get something else. And in Olympus, the outsiders are, arguably, the most interesting people in the whole story. Let's talk about Dionysus. Dionysus is the god of wine, ecstasy, theatre, and transformation. He's the god of things that escape control, which is extremely relevant when you understand his origin. Dionysus was the son of Zeus and Semele, a mortal woman who died before he was born. Hera, in her usual role as collateral damage recipient, tricked Semele into asking Zeus to reveal his true form. Zeus, bound by oath, complied. The full divine lightning of Zeus killed Semele instantly. Zeus, barely in time, cut the unborn Dionysus from her body and sewed the infant into his own thigh to carry him to term. Dionysus was born from his father's leg. He had no mother, no divine lineage on that side. He was half mortal, raised in hiding. He was not originally counted among the 12 Olympians. He was an outsider, and he spent his entire existence moving between the human world and the divine one, never fully belonging to either. Now, here's what's remarkable. Dionysus became one of the most worshipped figures in all of ancient Greece, more festivals in his name than almost any other deity. Theatre, one of the great civilizational achievements of ancient Greece, performed in his honor, the outsider, the half-mortal, the one born from a thigh. While the fully divine, properly pedigreed Olympians were receiving their dutiful sacrifices, Dionysus was getting the art. And he wasn't alone in this. Hermes, technically Olympian, son of Zeus and Maia, but always described as a trickster, a traveler, someone who moves between worlds. He's the messenger, the guide of souls to the underworld, the patron of thieves and merchants, the god of crossing boundaries. Hermes doesn't stay in one place. He doesn't fit in any single category, and he's the most useful god on Olympus precisely because of that. When you need something done that the established order can't do, you call Hermes. When Zeus needed someone to soothe Argus's 100 eyes so he could free Io, he sent Hermes. When the gods needed to retrieve Persephone from the underworld, they sent Hermes. When Odysseus needed help navigating divine traps, Hermes showed up. The outsider is always the one doing the actual work. This is a pattern you see in every major dynasty. The insiders hold the titles, the outsiders hold the capabilities. And the dynasty works until the insiders start believing the titles matter more than the capabilities. Which is exactly what happened to Olympus in the end. The 12 Olympians sat in their palaces, received their worship, fought their petty wars, managed their interminable family conflicts, while Hermes carried the messages. While Dionysus maintained the culture, while Hephaestus built everything they lived in, and when humanity eventually found a new story, a new model of the divine, the insider gods faded first. The outsider ones, Dionysus, Hermes, even Hephaestus, their archetypes survived longer. They turned up in new forms. The trickster, the craftsman, the transformer, the dynasty fell. The outsiders persisted. That's always how it ends. Here's the thing about Olympus that most retellings skip. The gods weren't just dysfunctional in private. They had a system for dealing with threats to their power. And when you map it out, when you actually trace the pattern, it is almost identical to every autocratic dynasty in recorded history. Let me show you what I mean. Step 1. Any being who might challenge Olympian power gets suppressed before they can become a threat. Atlas didn't fight on the right side in the Titan War. His punishment wasn't death, it was eternity holding up the sky on his shoulders. Think about the message of that punishment. Not execution, perpetual, exhausting, inescapable labor, visible to everyone. A constant reminder of what happens if you get on the wrong side of Olympus. That's not justice. That's a deterrent. Prometheus stole fire and gave it to humans. His punishment, chained to a rock for eternity, an eagle eating his liver every single day, the liver regrowing every night so it could be eaten again. Infinite, inescapable, deliberately theatrical suffering. Again, not death, display. Because if you kill someone, people forget. If you chain them to a rock and let everyone know about it, nobody forgets. Step 2. When someone from within the family challenges the order, the response is disproportionate and designed to humiliate. We talked about Hephaestus being thrown off Olympus. But then there's the case of Hera's full punishment after the revolt, hung by her wrists from the sky, the king of the gods' wife. publicly suspended in the atmosphere until she agreed to never defy him again. The message wasn't just to Hera, it was to every god watching. This is what happens, even to the queen. Step 3. Any human or semi-divine being who gets too powerful, too clever, or too beloved gets cut down. Bellerophon flew too high on Pegasus, was thrown to the earth, and spent his remaining years blind, crippled, wandering alone. Arachne was the best weaver in the world. She was arrogant about it, yes, but her punishment for daring to depict the gods' crimes on tapestry was to be transformed into a spider for eternity. She depicted their crimes, and she was silenced. Icarus flew too close to the sun. We use this as a metaphor for human hubris. But we skip the fact that Icarus was given wings by a father who was imprisoned by a king with divine connections. He had no other way off the island. The story is framed as a warning against ambition. But maybe it's a story about what happens when the powerful manufacture conditions where the powerless have no safe options, and then blame them for the outcome. Step 4. Rewrite the narrative after the fact. This one is subtle, but it's the most powerful tool in the playbook. Every act of violence committed by the gods is filtered through a story structure that positions the god as justified. Zeus destroyed humanity with a flood. The official reason: humans were wicked. Convenient, isn't it? The gods sent the Trojan War. The official reason: divine honor required it, not the tens of thousands of humans who died, not the city that burned. Apollo sent a plague to the Greek camp outside Troy. Why? Because Agamemnon, a human king, disrespected one of his priests. A disagreement over one priest. Hundreds of soldiers died. But in the mythology, the question is never, was this an appropriate use of divine power? The question is, what did the humans do to deserve it? Every dynasty needs a narrative department. The Olympians were so good at this that the narrative department operated for 3,000 years before we started asking the second newspaper question. Every great dynasty has a moment, a specific point where the whole thing almost unravels, where the contradictions build up so high that the structure can't hold them. For the British royal family, it was 1936 when the king chose love over the throne. For the Romanovs, it was the years before 1917 when the family's isolation became total and the people outside the palace gates ran out of patience. For Olympus, it came from the thing dynasties always forget to manage: the prophecy about their own children. Remember Cronos. Remember the prophecy, a child will overthrow you. So Cronos ate his children. Zeus was smarter about it. Kind of. There was a Titaness named Metis, goddess of wisdom, Zeus's first wife, and there was a prophecy that her child would be greater than their father. Zeus, having inherited the family paranoia about heirs, swallowed Metis whole. While she was pregnant, the child, Athena, was eventually born by being literally split out of Zeus's skull by Hephaestus with a bronze axe. She arrived fully formed, in armor, already a warrior. And Zeus raised her as his favorite child, so the solution to the heir problem was to physically consume the mother of his heir, absorb the wisdom she contained, and present the miraculous child as proof of his own power. The child whose mother he ate. This happens, by the way, after Zeus had already had a previous engagement with another prophesied heir problem. The sea nymph Thetis was so beautiful that both Zeus and Poseidon wanted her, until they found out a prophecy. Thetis' son would be greater than his father. Both gods immediately backed away and arranged Thetis' marriage to a mortal instead. That mortal son became Achilles, the greatest warrior in the world, who died young, who never threatened the gods. Problem contained. This is the thing about the Olympian dynasty that changes everything once you see it. The gods' relationship with humanity wasn't love, it wasn't stewardship, it was management. Humans were useful, humans provided worship, and the ancient sources are very clear that worship had a direct effect on divine power. More worship, more temples, more sacrifice, more prayer meant more power for the Olympians. So humans were, to put it bluntly, the gods' revenue stream. And like any organization that depends on a revenue stream, Olympus occasionally had to demonstrate value to justify continued investment. That's why heroes exist: Heracles, Perseus, Bellerophon, Theseus. Every great hero was, at some level, a project of divine investment. The gods gave them just enough help to solve a problem that threatened either human civilization or the gods' interests. And then they pulled back. Heracles was given his famous 12 labors as a consequence of being driven mad by Hera and killing his own family. The madness, Hera's doing. The punishment for the madness. 12 brutal, nearly impossible tasks. The credit for completing them. A legend that continues for thousands of years. Heracles did the work. He paid the price. The gods got the story. That's the arrangement. That's always been the arrangement. And every dynasty eventually faces the moment where the people providing the worship start to wonder if the gods are still worth it. Here's the most fascinating thing about the Olympian dynasty. It ended not with a war, not with another Titanomachy. It ended when the people who believed in it stopped believing. By the time of the Roman Empire, the gods were already changing. The Romans absorbed the Greek pantheon. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Ares became Mars. And in doing so, subtly shifted what they were for. The Roman gods became less about personality, less about story, more about function. Jupiter wasn't a character with a complicated marriage. He was the principle of divine authority. The story was being quietly sanitized. The dysfunction was being edited out. Because by then, people needed the mythology to justify the empire's own authority. And empires can't have their divine patron known primarily for infidelity and cannibalism. Then came Christianity, and with it, a different model entirely. One God, infinite, morally absolute, no siblings to negotiate with, no wife to deceive, no children to throw off mountains, no petty feuds, no favorites. After centuries of watching the Olympians operate like a dysfunctional royal court, the offer of a single, all-powerful, morally consistent deity was genuinely revolutionary. The Olympians didn't fall to a military conquest. They lost a culture war. They lost because their story, ultimately, was too human. Pause. Which is the strangest thing about all of this. The reason we created the Olympians the way we did, jealous, lustful, vindictive, brilliant, petty, sublime, is because we made them in our image. We gave the gods our politics, our family dynamics, our power structures, our worst impulses with the safety net of divinity removed. The Greeks weren't describing heaven, they were describing the palace, they were describing the court, they were describing every ruling dynasty they had ever seen or imagined, and that's why these stories lasted. Not because we believed in them, but because we recognized them. Here's something I find genuinely remarkable about the Greek relationship with their gods. The Greeks knew, on some level, they absolutely knew what they were doing when they built Olympus the way they did. There's a tradition in ancient Greek comedy, Aristophanes especially, where the gods are mocked openly, not whispered about, not coded, openly mocked. In one play, Zeus is depicted as barely competent. In another, the gods are shown as dependent on human worship in almost embarrassing ways. The Greeks built temples to these beings, and then went to the theatre and laughed at them. Both things were true at once. And in the tragedies, which are the plays that have lasted longest, the relationship with the gods is even more complex. In the tragedies, humans are consistently destroyed by forces they didn't choose and couldn't have avoided. Oedipus was fated. He did everything right by human standards, and it didn't matter. The gods had other plans. Agamemnon was sacrificed by his own family because of a war he didn't start and a divine feud that predated his birth. Cassandra could see the future, a gift from Apollo, and was cursed to never be believed. Apollo gave her the ability to see everything that was coming, and then made sure it would destroy her. The Greeks sat in their theatres and watched this, year after year, generation after generation. And they were not simple people. They were not primitive people who didn't understand cause and effect. They were people who built the Parthenon, who developed democracy, philosophy, mathematics, biology. They understood exactly what kind of gods they had. And the reason they kept them is actually quite profound. Not because they were naive, but because the alternative, a universe with no gods, no order, no system, even a broken one, was more terrifying. At least with the Olympians, you knew the rules. Capricious, unjust, arbitrary rules, but rules. You knew that crossing Artemis had consequences. You knew that hubris was dangerous. You knew that Poseidon was vengeful. An irrational system is still a system. You can navigate it, placate it, survive it. What you can't survive is chaos. What you can't navigate is the void. And so the Greeks maintained a relationship with gods they clearly, demonstrably, philosophically understood to be morally compromised. They made the calculation that an imperfect heaven was more useful than no heaven at all. That a flawed story about cosmic order was better than facing the possibility that there was no cosmic order. Sound familiar? It should. Because every generation makes that same calculation. Every culture does. You inherit the system. You see its contradictions. You maintain it anyway. Because dismantling it feels more dangerous than working around its flaws. The Greeks just had the unusual honesty to put it in the mythology. They wrote down the contradictions. They staged them at the theatre. They said, "This is our God. He is broken. We worship him." That level of cultural self-awareness is actually extraordinary, and we would do well to have a fraction of it when we look at the systems we maintain today. So here's where we land. After 3,000 years, after centuries of temples and sacrifices and epic poems and Hollywood movies and best-selling novels. What is the legacy of Olympus? Well, the power structure is still the same. The person at the top makes the rules and doesn't have to follow them. The person who challenges the top pays a price visible enough to warn everyone else. The person who suffers from the patriarch's behavior is reframed as the villain. The children absorb everything the family won't acknowledge. The victims become cautionary tales. The narrative gets managed. We know these patterns. We have always known these patterns. We wrote them down 3,000 years ago and we called them mythology. And then every generation looks at the Olympians and thinks, how primitive, how barbaric. How could they worship something like that? But here's the thing. The reason these stories travel is not because they're old. It's because they're current. Every time you read about a ruling family where one member holds all the power and everyone else exists in orbit around that power, absorbing its costs, that's Olympus. Every time you see the person who speaks out end up being the story instead of the one who caused the problem, that's Olympus. Every time a dynasty offers the world beauty and glory and achievement on one hand and leaves a trail of damage on the other, that's Olympus. The Greeks weren't warning us about monsters, they were warning us about systems. Systems that concentrate power in one place and call it divine right. Systems where accountability is for everyone except the person at the top. Systems that survive not because they're just, but because the alternative seems unimaginable. Cronos survived for ages because no one had seen what came before him. Zeus overthrew him because he was raised outside the system. And then Zeus became Cronos. Not immediately, not intentionally, but inevitably. Because that's what systems do. They don't care who's running them. They reproduce themselves. 3,000 years ago, the Greeks looked at the palaces around them, at the kings and priests and generals and dynasties, and they projected them onto the sky. They made their rulers into gods so they could ask the question they couldn't ask out loud. What does absolute power look like when no one can stop it? The answer was Zeus. The answer was Hera. The answer was Hephaestus, alone in his forge. The answer was Prometheus, on his rock. The answer was Hades underground, running a fair court in the dark while his golden brother took the worship. Every dynasty tells us something about the people who built it. And Olympus tells us something that 3,000 years of retelling hasn't managed to change. Power doesn't corrupt. Power reveals. It takes everything already present in a system, the generosity, the cruelty, the wisdom, the pettiness, and it amplifies it beyond anything accountability could contain. That's the real lesson of Olympus. Not the thunder, not the lightning, the silence in Hades, the patience of Hera, the forge in the dark. Those are the real stories. Now, I want to be clear about something. The Greeks who wrote these myths weren't fools. They weren't just telling entertaining stories. They were doing what every culture does when it can't directly name the thing it's living under. They were encoding it. In a world where you couldn't walk into the king's court and say, "This is unjust," you could go to the theatre, watch Zeus behave exactly like your king, and let the audience decide what they thought. That's what mythology was. That's what it still is, and that's why these stories don't need to be updated. They don't need to be modernized. You don't need to move them to contemporary Manhattan or put the gods in suits. The stories work exactly as they are because the systems they describe never really changed. We just renamed them. If you found this version of mythology interesting, the real story underneath the story, then subscribe, because every week we're going to come back here. To the myths your teachers rushed through, to the parts the sanitized versions edited out, to the questions the official stories never asked. Olympus was a dysfunctional dynasty. And honestly, it's not the last one we'll look at. See you next time.